The year is 1326. A lone figure stands before the towering walls of Bursa, the jewel of Byzantine Anatolia. His name is Orhan, son of Osman, leader of a small Turkish tribe that most of the world has never heard of. Behind him, an army that seems impossibly small compared to the task ahead. Before him, walls that have stood for centuries, protecting one of the richest cities in the East. In his heart, a vision that will change the course of history forever. How did this young warrior transform a tiny principality into the foundation of an empire that would rule for 600 years? How did he take this single city and turn it into the launching pad for one of history's greatest conquests? This is not just the story of battles and sieges. This is the story of a man who understood that true power comes not just from the sword, but from the mind. A man who would create systems that outlasted him by centuries. A man who would be remembered not just as a conqueror, but as a builder of civilizations. But to understand how Orhan came to stand before these walls, we must go back. Back to a time when the Ottoman name meant nothing. Back to the harsh mountains of northwestern Anatolia, where survival itself was a daily struggle. The world Orhan was born into, around the year 1281, was a world in chaos. The great Seljuk Empire that had once dominated Anatolia was crumbling, broken into dozens of small principalities called beyliks. The Mongol invasions had shattered the old order. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened and exhausted, still clung to its coastal cities and fortresses. And into this fractured landscape came the Turkish tribes, warriors and nomads seeking land, seeking glory, seeking a new home. Orhan's father, Osman, was the leader of one such tribe. Not the largest, not the richest, not the most powerful, but Osman had something that set him apart. He had vision, he had patience, and most importantly, he had chosen his location wisely. The small beylik that Osman carved out sat on the frontier between the Islamic world and Christian Byzantium. This was not an accident. This was strategy. On the frontier, a warrior could prove himself. On the frontier, ambitious men could rise. On the frontier, the rules of the old world did not apply. Orhan grew up in this world of constant warfare, where every valley could hide an enemy, where every negotiation could end in betrayal, where survival required both strength and cunning. From his earliest years, his father made sure he understood the realities of power. Young Orhan learned to ride before he could properly walk. He learned to use a bow while other children played games. He learned to read men's intentions in their eyes, to understand when to strike and when to wait. But Osman taught his son something even more important. He taught him that conquest alone was not enough. Any bandit could raid and plunder. Any warlord could take a city and watch it crumble. True greatness came from building something that would last. True power came from creating systems, institutions, loyalty that transcended a single lifetime. These lessons would shape everything Orhan would become. As a young man, Orhan fought beside his father in countless skirmishes and raids. The Ottomans, as Osman's followers were beginning to be called, were building their reputation one battle at a time. They raided Byzantine villages, yes, but they also protected the local Turkish population. They took Christian prisoners, yes, but they also offered them a choice: convert and join, or pay a tax and live in peace. This was revolutionary. Most beyliks simply destroyed everything in their path. The Ottomans were building an army, an administration, a state. And the Byzantines, distracted by civil wars and threats from all sides, barely noticed this small beylik growing stronger on their border. They had bigger problems, or so they thought. In 1299, Osman declared independence from the weakening Seljuk Sultanate. It was a bold move, but the time was right. The Ottomans were no longer just raiders. They were becoming a power in their own right. And Orhan, now a young warrior in his late teens, was at his father's side, learning, watching, preparing. The first decades of the new century saw the Ottomans expand slowly but steadily. They took villages, then towns, then small fortresses. Each conquest was consolidated, organized, integrated into the growing Ottoman system. Christian farmers who submitted were allowed to keep their lands. Soldiers who surrendered were offered positions in the Ottoman army. Administrators who cooperated were given roles in Ottoman governance. This was not just conquest. This was state building. But there was one prize that eluded Osman throughout his life. Bursa. The great city sat in its valley, protected by massive walls, garrisoned by Byzantine troops, supplied by the nearby coast. It was wealthy beyond imagination, a center of silk trade, a city of gardens and palaces. It was everything the Ottomans were not, and Osman wanted it more than anything. For years, he laid siege to Bursa. Not a continuous siege, that would have been impossible with his limited forces. But a war of attrition, cutting off its trade routes, raiding its surrounding villages, slowly strangling the city's economy. The Byzantines sent relief forces, but they were defeated. They sent diplomats to negotiate, but Osman's terms were simple: surrender or starve. By 1324, Osman was an old man, his health failing, his body worn down by decades of warfare. But Bursa still stood. It became an obsession, a symbol. If he could take Bursa, it would prove that the Ottomans were more than just another Beylik. It would prove they were the future. But time was running out. Osman knew he would not live to see the walls fall. And so he made a decision that would define the Ottoman dynasty for centuries to come. He called his sons to his bedside. Orhan, the eldest and most capable. Alaeddin, younger but brilliant in his own right. Osman looked at them with eyes that had seen too much war, too much blood, too much ambition realized and deferred. "My sons," he said, and his voice was weak but his will was iron. "I have built something from nothing. I have taken a tribe of nomads and created a state. But my work is not finished. Bursa must fall. It must become our capital. Without it, we are still just frontier raiders. With it, we become an empire. Orhan, you will be the bey after me. You will take Bursa. You will build on what I have started. But remember this. An empire is not held by the sword alone. You must be just. You must be wise. You must create systems that work even when you are not there to enforce them. Alaeddin, you will be your brother's vizier, his closest advisor. You will help him build what I have only dreamed of. Swear to me now that you will work together, that you will not let ambition divide you as it has divided so many ruling families." The brothers swore, and Osman, satisfied that his legacy would continue, closed his eyes for the last time in 1323 or 1324. The exact date lost to history. He never saw Bursa fall. But he died knowing it would. Orhan was now the bey, the leader of the Ottomans. He was in his early 40s, tested in battle, trained in administration, ready for the responsibility. But he also knew that his first act would define his entire reign. He had to take Bursa. Not just for strategic reasons, though those were important. Not just for economic reasons, though the city's wealth would transform the Ottoman state. But for symbolic reasons. His father had died with this dream unfulfilled. Orhan would fulfill it. He intensified the siege. Ottoman forces cut off every road, every path, every secret trail that led to Bursa. They seized the surrounding fortresses one by one. They destroyed any Byzantine relief force that tried to break through. Inside the city, food grew scarce. The wealthy began hoarding what supplies remained. The poor began to starve. The garrison remained loyal, but they knew the end was coming. They were soldiers, not fools. The Byzantines sent desperate messages to Constantinople, begging for help. But the empire was in chaos, torn by civil war between rival claimants to the throne. Bursa was on its own. Month after month, the siege continued. Orhan was patient. He had learned from his father that haste leads to mistakes, that desperation leads to defeat. He could wait. Time was on his side. Inside Bursa, the situation grew more desperate with each passing week. Disease began to spread through the crowded streets. People ate dogs, cats, rats, anything they could find. The Byzantine commander knew he had no choice. He could watch his people die slowly, or he could negotiate terms. In 1326, after nearly a decade of siege, the gates of Bursa finally opened. Not with a crash of battering rams, not with the screams of assault, but with a negotiation. The Byzantine garrison was allowed to leave with honor, their weapons and their lives intact. The Christian population was given protection and allowed to keep their property. Bursa was now Ottoman, and this is where we return to that moment. Orhan standing before the walls of Bursa. But now the gates are open. Now he enters not as a conqueror drunk on victory, but as a ruler taking possession of what will become his capital. He walks through streets lined with people who eye him with fear, with curiosity, with cautious hope. He sees the silk workshops, the markets, the churches, the palaces. He sees wealth beyond anything the Ottomans have ever possessed. And he sees opportunity. That night, Orhan stood in what had been the Byzantine governor's palace. He looked out over the city, its lights flickering in the darkness. His brother Aladdin stood beside him. "What are you thinking, brother?" Aladdin asked. Orhan was silent for a long moment. "I am thinking," he finally said, "that my father gave me a small beylik and a dream. And now I stand in the greatest city we have ever taken. But this is not the end. This is the beginning. We must make this city the heart of something greater. We must build an empire that will last not just years but centuries." Aladdin smiled. "Then we have much work to do." And they did, because taking Bursa was one thing. Building an empire was another entirely. The first decision Orhan made was to honor his word to the Christian population. Unlike many conquerors of his time, he did not allow his troops to plunder the city. He did not force conversions. He established clear rules. Christians and Jews could practice their faith freely if they paid the jizya tax. They could own property, conduct business, even hold administrative positions. This was not just mercy. This was strategy. A terrorized population is a rebellious population. A population that feels fairly treated is a productive population. And Orhan needed productivity. He needed the wealth of Bursa to fund his next conquests. He also needed legitimacy. It was one thing to rule over Turkish nomads and warriors. It was another to rule over an ancient city with its educated population, its complex economy, its centuries of tradition. Orhan began to transform himself from a tribal war leader into a true monarch. He established a court with formal protocols. He minted coins with his name, a powerful symbol of sovereignty. He began construction of mosques, madrasas, hospitals, and markets. He was showing both his own people and his new subjects that the Ottomans were not just conquerors, they were builders of civilization. But he never forgot that his power ultimately rested on military strength. And so he turned his attention to creating something that would become legendary, a professional standing army. Until this point, Ottoman forces had been mostly tribal cavalry, warriors who fought when called but returned to their lands when the campaign was over. This was fine for raids and short sieges. But for sustained conquest, for holding territory, for projecting power, Orhan needed something more. He needed soldiers who fought not just for booty but for salary. Soldiers who were loyal not just to their tribe but to the state. Soldiers who could be trained, disciplined, and deployed wherever they were needed. Working with his brother Aladdin, Orhan began to lay the groundwork for what would eventually become the Janissary Corps, though the system would not be fully developed until later in his reign and beyond. The principle was revolutionary. Take Christian boys through the Devshirme system, a kind of levy, convert them to Islam, train them from childhood as soldiers, and create an elite corps loyal only to the Sultan. They would have no tribal ties, no local loyalties, no competing allegiances. They would be the perfect tool of imperial power. But this was still in its early stages. For now, Orhan focused on more conventional military reforms. He regularized pay for his soldiers. He established clear chains of command. He invested in siege equipment and engineers. He created logistical systems to supply armies in the field. These might sound like boring administrative details, but they were the foundation of everything that followed. An army that is well paid does not desert. An army that is well fed can sustain long campaigns. An army that is well organized can execute complex maneuvers. Orhan understood this in his bones. With Bursa secured and his military reformed, Orhan looked to his next targets. To the east were other Turkish beyliks, potential allies or rivals. To the west and north were Byzantine territories, wealthy but increasingly weak. Orhan chose to focus westward. The Byzantines had cities, ports, trade wealth. Taking them would not only expand Ottoman power but also bring in the resources needed for further expansion. Between 1326 and 1330, Orhan's forces methodically reduced the remaining Byzantine fortresses in northwestern Anatolia. Each campaign was carefully planned. Each siege was prosecuted with patience. Each victory was consolidated with the same policy that had worked in Bursa: protection for those who submitted, destruction for those who resisted. The Byzantine Empire, distracted by its own civil wars and unable to spare forces for distant Anatolia, could do nothing but watch as city after city fell to this rising power. In 1331, Orhan achieved another major triumph: the capture of Nicaea, known to the Turks as Iznik. This was an ancient city, site of two crucial church councils, a place of enormous symbolic importance to Christianity. Its loss was a devastating blow to Byzantine morale. But for Orhan, it was another piece in the puzzle he was assembling. Nicaea was even closer to Constantinople than Bursa. The Ottomans were no longer a frontier beylik. They were a threat to the very heart of the Byzantine Empire. And everyone knew it. The Byzantine Emperor, Andronikos III, finally recognized the danger. He could not ignore the Ottomans any longer. But he also could not defeat them. He was fighting a civil war against his own grandfather. He was dealing with Serbian expansion in the Balkans. He was trying to hold together an empire that was falling apart from within. So he did what desperate rulers often do. He tried to buy time through diplomacy. Byzantine envoys arrived at Orhan's court in Bursa bearing gifts and proposals. An alliance perhaps. A marriage alliance. Trade agreements. Anything to stop the Ottoman advance. Orhan received them with courtesy. He listened to their proposals with apparent interest. And then he made a counter-offer that revealed his true ambitions. He would agree to peace, he said, if the Byzantines ceded certain territories to Ottoman control. If they paid tribute. If they recognized Ottoman sovereignty over the lands already taken. In other words, if they admitted that the balance of power had shifted. The envoys returned to Constantinople with these terms. Andronikos had no choice but to accept most of them. The alternative was a war he could not win. And so, in the early 1330s, a kind of peace settled over northwestern Anatolia. But everyone understood it was temporary. Orhan was simply consolidating his gains, preparing for the next move. And that next move would be his most audacious yet. Because Orhan was not content with conquering Anatolia. He had begun to look across the narrow straits that separated Asia from Europe. He had begun to look at the Byzantine territories in Thrace and beyond. He had begun to envision Ottoman power extending into Europe itself. This was not just ambition. This was strategic vision. Anatolia was crowded with Turkish beyliks, all competing for limited resources. Europe, by contrast, was wealthy and comparatively weakly defended. The Byzantine Empire was a hollow shell. The Balkan kingdoms were divided. A strong, united force could achieve extraordinary things there. But first, Orhan needed to secure his base. He needed to ensure that when Ottoman armies crossed into Europe, they would not be stabbed in the back by rivals in Anatolia. Throughout the 1330s and 1340s, Orhan engaged in a complex dance of diplomacy and warfare with the other Turkish beyliks. Sometimes he allied with them against Byzantine targets. Sometimes he fought them for control of key cities. Always, he was expanding Ottoman influence, bringing more territory under his control, absorbing rivals, eliminating threats. One of his key advantages was the administrative system he and his brother had built. While other beyliks were still essentially tribal confederations, the Ottomans had courts, treasuries, bureaucracies. They could tax effectively, which meant they could pay armies. They could administer justice, which meant their territories were more stable. They could offer opportunities to talented individuals regardless of their origin, which meant they attracted the best and the brightest. This was soft power, but it was just as important as military power. By the late 1340s, Orhan was the most powerful ruler in Anatolia. He controlled a large, wealthy, well-administered state. He commanded a strong, disciplined army. He had wise advisors, most notably his brother Alaeddin, who served as Grand Vizier and was the architect of much of the Ottoman administrative system. The stage was set for the great leap into Europe. But opportunity would come not through conquest, but through an invitation. In 1341, the Byzantine Empire plunged into another civil war, this one even more destructive than the previous ones. John V Palaiologos and John VI Kantakozinos both claimed the throne. Each sought allies wherever they could find them. And Kantakozinos, desperate for military support, turned to Orhan. He offered the Ottoman leader a deal. Military assistance in exchange for territorial concessions and a marriage alliance. Kantakozinos would give his daughter Theodora in marriage to Orhan, cementing an alliance between the two powers. In return, Ottoman forces would fight on behalf of Kantakozinos against his rival. For Orhan, this was an extraordinary opportunity. He would be paid to send his armies into Europe. He would gain a foothold across the straits. He would learn European terrain, European warfare, European politics. And he would be doing it all as an invited guest, not an invader. It was almost too good to be true. Orhan accepted immediately. In 1346, he married Theodora, daughter of a Byzantine emperor. The wedding was a grand affair, symbolizing the strange alliance between the rising Islamic power and the declining Christian empire. For Theodora, it must have been terrifying, leaving everything she knew to marry a Muslim ruler twice her age. For Orhan, it was a triumph, a mark of how far he and his people had come. Ottoman troops crossed into Europe for the first time in 1346, fighting alongside Kantakozenos's forces. They fought well, proving themselves to be disciplined and effective even on unfamiliar terrain. They learned the landscape, the roads, the cities, the fortresses. They learned Byzantine military tactics and weaknesses. They made contacts with local populations, and they began to understand that Europe was not as formidable as it might have seemed from across the water. The Byzantine Civil War dragged on for several more years, with Ottoman forces playing an increasingly important role. And with each campaign, Orhan's soldiers became more familiar with Thrace, the European territory closest to Constantinople. They began to see it not as foreign land, but as potential Ottoman land. In 1352, an earthquake struck the region of Gallipoli, the narrow peninsula controlling the straits between Asia and Europe. The walls of several fortresses collapsed. Byzantine attention was focused on the ongoing civil war, and Ottoman forces, who just happened to be in the area, occupied the fortresses. When the Byzantines protested, Orhan expressed regret but made no move to withdraw. He was too busy rebuilding and strengthening the fortifications, turning them into permanent Ottoman bases. This was the true beginning of the Ottoman presence in Europe, not through a grand invasion, but through opportunism, patience, and an earthquake. By the time the Byzantine Civil War ended in 1354 with Kantakozenos emerging victorious, it was too late. The Ottomans were in Europe, and they were not leaving. Emperor John VI Kantakozenos had won his civil war, but at a catastrophic cost. He had invited the Ottomans into Europe. He had allowed them to establish bases from which they could not be dislodged. He had paid for his throne with the future of his empire. Within a few years, he would be forced to abdicate, broken by the realization of what he had done. But for Orhan, these were years of triumph. From the fortresses around Gallipoli, Ottoman forces began to raid into Thrace. Not yet permanent conquest, not yet large-scale settlement, but probing attacks, testing defenses, gathering intelligence, keeping the Byzantines off balance. Back in Anatolia, Orhan continued to expand and consolidate. In 1337, he had captured Nicomedia, completing his conquest of the southeastern shore of the Sea of Marmara. Each new city brought more wealth, more soldiers, more administrative capacity. But Orhan was getting older. He was now in his 70s, an extraordinary age for a medieval warrior king. Most of his contemporaries had died decades earlier. Yet he remained active, engaged, still planning, still building. He had achieved more than his father could have dreamed. He had transformed a small beylik into a major regional power. He had captured some of the greatest cities in Anatolia. He had established the Ottoman presence in Europe. He had created administrative and military systems that would outlast him. But he also knew that everything he had built could be destroyed by incompetent succession. He had seen it happen to other dynasties, watched as kingdoms tore themselves apart in civil wars between rival sons. He was determined that this would not happen to the Ottomans. Orhan had several sons, but the most capable was Suleiman Pasha, who had led many of the campaigns in Europe. Suleiman was brave, intelligent, a natural leader. He understood his father's vision and was committed to carrying it forward. Orhan began to prepare him for the succession, involving him in decisions, teaching him the arts of governance as well as war. But fate had other plans. In 1357, Suleiman Pasha died in a hunting accident. The details are unclear, lost to time. But the impact was devastating. Orhan had lost his heir, his most capable son, the one he had been grooming to take over. For a man who had built his life on planning and preparation, this must have been an almost unbearable blow. He now turned to his son Murad, younger than Suleiman but also capable. Murad had fought in his father's campaigns, had learned the family business of conquest and administration. He would have to do. Orhan spent his final years ensuring that Murad understood what needed to be done, preparing him for the challenges ahead. But he also knew that the most important thing he could give his son was not advice but a stable, well-organized state. The stronger the foundations, the easier Murad's task would be. And so Orhan focused on strengthening those foundations. He reformed the tax system, making it more efficient and less prone to corruption. He established more madrasas, Islamic schools that would produce the educated administrators the empire would need. He encouraged trade, welcoming merchants from across the Mediterranean and beyond. He built mosques and public works that served both practical and symbolic purposes. In his last years, Orhan began to reflect on what he had accomplished. He had spent his entire adult life at war, but he had also spent it building. He had taken a small beylik and transformed it into the foundation of an empire. He had established systems and institutions that would last for centuries. He had placed Ottoman forces in Europe, opening the door to conquests that would shake the continent. When Orhan died in 1362, probably in his early 80s, he left his son Murad not just a kingdom but a machine for conquest. The administrative systems were in place. The military was professional and disciplined. The treasury was full. The ideology of expansion, of bringing order to chaos, of building a universal Islamic state, was deeply embedded in Ottoman culture. Murad would use this inheritance to conquer deep into the Balkans, to make the Ottomans a truly European power. His son Bayezid would threaten Constantinople itself. And Murad's great-great-grandson Mehmed would finally accomplish what Orhan could only dream of, the conquest of Constantinople and the end of the Byzantine Empire. But all of that was built on what Orhan created. He was the one who transformed the Ottomans from tribal warriors into empire builders. He was the one who created the administrative structures that allowed the empire to function. He was the one who established the Ottoman foothold in Europe. He was the one who understood that conquest without consolidation is meaningless. Let us step back and understand what made Orhan so remarkable. He was a man of his time in many ways. A warrior, a conqueror, someone who did not hesitate to use violence when he thought it necessary. But he was also something more. He was a state builder. He understood that true power comes not from winning battles but from creating systems that endure. He understood that a diverse empire requires tolerance and flexibility, not just force. He understood that investing in education, infrastructure, and institutions would pay dividends far beyond any immediate military victory. Consider the policy toward Christians in conquered territories. Many of Orhan's contemporaries, both Muslim and Christian, practiced religious conquest. Convert or die, convert or be expelled. Orhan took a different approach. Christians could remain Christians if they paid the jizya tax and accepted Ottoman rule. This was not primarily about tolerance in the modern sense, it was about pragmatism. A Christian peasant who was allowed to keep his farm and his faith would keep farming, producing food and taxes. A Christian merchant who was protected in his business would keep trading, generating wealth. A Christian craftsman who was left alone would keep producing goods. This approach meant that Ottoman territories were more stable, more prosperous, and more productive than they would have been under a policy of forced conversion or expulsion. It also meant that the Ottoman state attracted people who were fleeing persecution elsewhere. Jews fleeing Christian Europe would later find refuge in Ottoman lands. Christian groups at odds with Orthodox or Catholic orthodoxy found the Ottomans more tolerant than their co-religionists. This created a diverse, cosmopolitan empire that was stronger for its diversity. Consider also Orhan's relationship with his brother Alaeddin. In most medieval dynasties, brothers were rivals, threats to be eliminated or at least marginalized. But Orhan and Alaeddin worked together throughout Orhan's reign. Alaeddin served as Grand Vizier, the chief administrator, and by all accounts was the architect of much of the Ottoman administrative system. He created the regular army structure. He organized the tax system. He established the protocols of the Ottoman court. And Orhan trusted him completely, never fearing that his brother would try to seize power. This was remarkable. It showed that Orhan valued competence and loyalty over paranoia. It showed that he could share power with someone he trusted. And it set a precedent, unfortunately not always followed, that the Ottoman state should be based on meritocracy and ability rather than just heredity. Consider Orhan's military strategy. He was not a reckless conqueror throwing armies at heavily fortified positions in hopes of a glorious victory. He was methodical, patient, strategic. When he laid siege to a city, he was prepared to wait months or even years for it to fall. He understood that starving out a city was less costly in lives than storming it. He understood that offering reasonable terms to a besieged garrison was often more effective than threatening massacre, because it encouraged other cities to surrender rather than fight to the death. His campaigns were carefully planned with clear objectives. He did not overextend his forces or his supply lines. He did not start wars he could not finish. This disciplined approach meant that his conquests were sustainable. He did not win great victories only to lose them months later because he could not hold what he had taken. Consider how Orhan positioned the Ottoman state. He was surrounded by other Turkish beyliks in Anatolia, all of them competing for the same resources and territory. Instead of trying to conquer them all, which would have been difficult and costly, he focused on the Byzantine territories to the west and north. These were wealthy, relatively weakly defended, and taking them did not make enemies of all his Turkish neighbors simultaneously. This strategic choice meant that Orhan could focus his energies, avoid fighting on multiple fronts, and expand into areas where expansion was easiest. It was a simple principle, but many rulers failed to follow it. Fight the battles you can win, avoid the battles you cannot. Orhan instinctively understood this. Consider the symbolic importance of his conquests. Bursa, Nicaea, Nicomedia. These were not just strategically important cities, they were psychologically important. They were ancient cities, famous cities, cities that had stood for centuries. When they fell to the Ottomans, it sent a message. This was not just another beylik that would rise and fall within a generation. This was a power that could challenge the established order. This was the future. The symbolic weight of these conquests attracted followers, impressed allies, and demoralized enemies. Orhan understood that in politics and war, perception is often as important as reality. And consider, finally, his vision for the future. Orhan was not content with being the most powerful beylik in Anatolia. He looked beyond, to Europe, to Constantinople itself, to building something that would last. He planted the seeds that would grow into an empire spanning 3 continents. He created the tools, the institutions, the ideology that would carry the Ottomans from obscurity to dominance. When historians look at the Ottoman Empire, they often focus on the spectacular conquests. Mehmed II taking Constantinople, Suleiman the Magnificent at the gates of Vienna. But those conquests were built on foundations laid by Orhan. He was the one who created the state structure that made everything else possible. He was the one who established the military traditions that would make Ottoman armies feared across Europe and Asia. He was the one who showed that the Ottomans were not just conquerors but state builders. What would the world look like if Orhan had not lived, or if he had been incompetent? His father Osman had created a small beylik, but there were dozens of small beyliks in Anatolia at that time. Most of them vanished within a generation or two, absorbed by rivals or destroyed by the Mongols or the Mamluks. The Ottoman beylik could easily have suffered the same fate. Without Orhan's patient, methodical expansion, without his administrative reforms, without his vision of empire, the Ottomans might have remained just another footnote in the history of medieval Anatolia. Constantinople might have fallen to some other power, or survived for decades longer. The history of Europe would have been completely different. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, all were influenced by the Ottoman presence in Europe. Remove that presence, and the entire trajectory of Western civilization changes. This is the mark of a truly consequential historical figure. Not just someone who achieved great things in their own lifetime, but someone whose actions shaped centuries to come. Orhan was such a figure. He took the raw material his father had given him and forged it into something that would outlast him by 600 years. But who was Orhan as a person, beyond his accomplishments? The historical record gives us only glimpses. We know he was intelligent, patient, strategic. We know he could be merciful to defeated enemies but ruthless when necessary. We know he valued education and learning, founding madrasas and supporting scholars. We know he maintained the respect and loyalty of his followers throughout a 40-year reign, which suggests he had charisma and political skill. We know he worked closely with his brother without apparent jealousy or conflict, which suggests emotional maturity and security. But we do not know his doubts, his fears, his private thoughts. We do not know how he felt standing before the walls of Bursa, knowing that his father had died without seeing them fall. We do not know how he felt when he first crossed into Europe, knowing he was opening a door that could never be closed. We do not know how he felt when his son Suleiman died, destroying years of careful succession planning. These human moments are lost to us. What we have instead are his deeds, and they speak clearly. In an age of chaos and violence, he built order. In an age of tribal loyalties and personal ambition, he built institutions that transcended individuals. In an age when most rulers thought in terms of their own lifetime, he built for eternity. When Orhan died in 1362, he was buried in Bursa, the city that symbolized his entire reign. The tomb still stands today, a monument to the man who transformed a tribe into a dynasty. His son Murad succeeded him smoothly, the succession carefully prepared, the state stable and strong. And Murad took the machine his father had built and used it to conquer. Within a decade, Ottoman armies had pushed deep into the Balkans. Within a generation, they had defeated the Serbs and Bulgarians. Within a century, they had taken Constantinople. Each of these conquests was built on the foundations Orhan had laid. The administrative systems, the military traditions, the ideology of expansion and state building. The Ottoman Empire that Orhan helped create would last until 1922, more than 5.5 centuries after his death. It would at its height control territories from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iraq. It would be one of the great world powers, feared and respected across 3 continents. It would leave a lasting impact on the Middle East, the Balkans, North Africa, and Europe itself. And all of it traces back to those critical decades when Orhan took a small beylik and transformed it into the foundation of an empire. This is his legacy. Not the specific battles he won, though those were important. Not the specific cities he conquered, though those were significant. But the vision he had and the institutions he created to realize that vision. He understood something that many rulers never grasp. That true power is not about personal glory or immediate conquest. True power is about building systems that last, about creating institutions that function even without you, about establishing a trajectory that continues long after you are gone. Orhan did this. He took the energy and ambition of the Turkish tribes and channeled them into state building. He took the military prowess of the frontier warriors and supplemented it with discipline and organization. He took the religious fervor of the Ghazis, the warriors fighting on the frontier of Islam, and combined it with pragmatic tolerance that allowed diverse populations to coexist. He created something new, something that had not existed before. A state that was simultaneously Islamic and multi-religious, nomadic in its origins but sophisticated in its administration, Turkish in its core but universal in its ambitions. And he did it all in one lifetime, starting from a position of relative weakness and ending as the most powerful ruler in his region. This required not just military skill but also political wisdom, strategic patience, administrative ability, and personal integrity. It required the ability to inspire loyalty in his followers, to strike fear in his enemies, to earn respect from neutrals. It required knowing when to fight and when to negotiate, when to be merciful and when to be ruthless, when to preserve traditions and when to innovate. These are rare qualities in any era. That Orhan possessed them all made him one of the most consequential figures in medieval history. When we stand back and look at the sweep of history, we see certain individuals who serve as hinges, moments when the trajectory of human events shifts onto a new path. Orhan was such a hinge. Before him, the Ottomans were one beylik among many, with no clear reason why they should be the ones to create an empire. After him, the path to empire was clear. The tools were in place, the momentum was established. He did not live to see the Ottoman Empire at its height, but he made that height possible. He planted the acorn from which the mighty oak would grow. And now, more than 6.5 centuries after his death, we can look back and recognize him for what he was. A state builder of genius, a strategist of rare ability, and the true founder of one of history's great empires. His father Osman gave the dynasty its name. His great-great-grandson Mehmed gave it its greatest city. His descendant Suleiman gave it its greatest extent. But Orhan gave it the tools, the institutions, the systems that made all the rest possible. Without him, there would have been no Ottoman Empire. With him, that empire became inevitable. This is the story of how a young warrior standing before the walls of Bursa became the architect of an empire. This is the story of how patient planning defeated immediate gratification. This is the story of how institution building triumphed over personal ambition. This is the story of Orhan, second ruler of the Ottomans, first builder of their empire. A man who understood that conquest without administration is meaningless. That military power without economic strength is hollow. That religious fervor without pragmatic tolerance is self-defeating. That personal charisma without institutional stability is fleeting. He understood all these things not as abstract principles but as practical necessities. And he acted on that understanding, year after year, decade after decade, until the small beylik his father had led became a major power that would dominate its region for centuries. History remembers the conquerors, the great generals who won spectacular battles. Tamerlane, who built an empire through terror. Alexander, who conquered the known world in a decade. Genghis Khan, who created the largest land empire in history. But history often forgets the builders, the administrators, the strategists who created systems that lasted. Orhan deserves to be remembered alongside the conquerors, because what he built outlasted their conquests. The empires of Alexander, Tamerlane, and Genghis Khan fragmented within a generation of their deaths. The empire Orhan helped create lasted for centuries. This is the paradox of history. The spectacular is remembered, but the substantial is what matters. Orhan was not spectacular in the way that some conquerors were. He did not win battles against impossible odds. He did not conquer vast territories in lightning campaigns. He did not cut through his enemies like a whirlwind. What he did was build, slowly and carefully, a state that could sustain expansion over centuries. He did it through patience, through planning, through creating systems that worked. This is less dramatic than a great battlefield victory, but it is far more important. Anyone with enough soldiers and enough luck can win a battle. Creating a state that lasts requires something more: vision, discipline, wisdom. Orhan had these qualities in abundance. And that is why, 6.5 centuries after his death, we still remember his name and still feel the impact of what he created. The Ottoman Empire is gone now, dissolved in the aftermath of World War I. But its influence remains. The borders of the modern Middle East were shaped by its collapse. The religious and ethnic complexities of the Balkans are in part its legacy. The architecture of Istanbul, of Cairo, of Damascus bears its mark. The traditions of governance in Turkey and beyond are influenced by Ottoman precedents. And all of this traces back to those critical years when Orhan took his father's legacy and transformed it into something that would shape world history. He could not have known, standing before the walls of Bursa in 1326, what the consequences of his actions would be. He could not have imagined that the state he was building would last until the 20th century, that it would control territories he had never heard of, that it would be remembered as one of the great empires of human history. But perhaps, in his private moments, he dreamed of such things. Perhaps he understood that he was building something special, something that would outlast him. Perhaps that is why he worked so hard to create institutions, to establish precedents, to build a state rather than just winning victories. We cannot know, but we can look at what he accomplished and recognize it for what it was, one of the great achievements of medieval statecraft. A small tribe transformed into an empire. A collection of warriors transformed into a sophisticated state. A beylik on the Byzantine frontier transformed into a power that would dominate Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries. This was Orhan's work, this was his legacy, and this is why, more than 600 years after his death, his name deserves to be remembered and his achievements celebrated. He was a warrior when he needed to be, a diplomat when that served better, an administrator always. He built an empire not in a day but in a lifetime of careful, patient, strategic work. And what he built lasted long after he was gone, which is the ultimate measure of any leader's success. This is the story of Orhan.